support. Obviously, we've had something come to the surface that's been hidden to a very small select group of people, something that we've been walking with for several years now. And
he did not demand a microphone. He did not post a rebuttal. He did not use his mother's death to settle the argument. Jonathan Lamb, fired from the network his parents built, not called to his mother's deathbed, seated in the far corner of her memorial service, separated from his siblings, kept away from the platform, went home. And 2 days later, he wrote about Tetris. About Scrabble games she always won, about helping him move into his college dorm room, about her love for God and her passion to see souls saved, about looking forward to seeing her again in eternity. That post, quiet, personal, and entirely gracious, is the most significant thing anyone has said about the Daystar story since Joni Lamb died. Not because it resolves the institutional questions. It does not. Not because it answers the financial questions. It does not. But because it forces every person who has been following this story to ask themselves a harder question than the ones they have been asking about the network. What does it actually look like to pursue accountability without losing grace? The front row, nobody noticed. Before the post, there was the memorial. On May 18, 2026, Gateway Church in Southlake, Texas held the service. Friends wept. Daughters spoke. A prominent pastor delivered a eulogy. Pre-recorded messages from world leaders called Joni Lamb courageous and a warrior for God. Jonathan was there. He had come. He sat in the front row on the far right, separated from the family members who occupied the platform and the spotlight. Cameras did not pick him up. His name was spoken once from the pulpit, not in warmth, but in what those present described as a passive acknowledgement wrapped inside a broader institutional defense of his mother against her critics. His sisters delivered their tributes. Neither acknowledged that he was in the room. He had brought close friends. With him, Kenyon Coleman, a former Dallas Cowboys defensive end, and his wife, Katie. Shortly before the service began, Jonathan and Susie texted to say their friends had been directed to a different section of the building. They would not be permitted to sit together. When the Colemans found the eulogy so offensive that they chose to leave, security personnel followed them out. Katie Coleman posted on Instagram afterward. She wrote that she had never seen a man and his family more disrespected than what she witnessed that day in the house of God. The only speaker who acknowledged Jonathan by name with anything resembling warmth was not a family member. It was a pre-recorded message from the President of the United States, who listed each of Joni's children and told them their mother was looking down on them with love. That single detail, that the most personal acknowledgement Jonathan received at his mother's funeral came from the Oval Office and not from the platform where his siblings stood, does not require commentary. It speaks for itself. The post that changed the conversation. 2 days later, Jonathan wrote. He thanked people for honoring his mother. He described her love for the Lord. He wrote about her passion to see people come to faith. And then he went personal. The specific, small memories that no press release and no institutional statement can manufacture. Helping him move into his college dorm room, making sure it felt like home. Cornhole in the backyard, Tetris on the couch, Scrabble games she always won, and laughed about winning. He wrote that her legacy would always come back to her love for God and her desire to see souls saved. He said he looked forward to the reunion they would one day have, his mother, his father Marcus, and himself. And then he said simply, "I love my mom." Nearly 10,000 people liked that post. Hundreds comment. And the reason it landed the way it did was not because it was dramatic or strategic or carefully positioned. It was because it was none of those things. It was a son, in genuine grief, choosing to remember the human being and not the argument. Jonathan Lamb had more documented reason than almost anyone to make this moment about everything that went wrong. He was fired. He was not called to say goodbye. He was separated from his family at her memorial. He sat in that auditorium and listened to a eulogy that some of the people closest to him experienced as a rebuke delivered in his direction from a pulpit at his own mother's funeral. He came home and wrote about Scrabble, what Susie said. Susie Lamb's statement, published shortly after Joni's death, carries the same weight, and it does so with the same refusal to flatten grief into a simple narrative. She wrote that she was angry because of what had been taken, but she wrote that one thing would remain, that she had loved Joni with her whole heart, that even when they had to do the hardest thing, sharing what they believed to be the truth publicly, they had loved her. She wrote about parting ways because of different choices. She wrote about choosing forgiveness every day. She wrote that she had been certain a miracle would happen, that she had dreamed of sitting on a beach again, drinking coffee, talking about Jesus, feeling Joni's warm hug. I'm angry because that didn't happen here on Earth, but I have to release it and keep trusting God. She deleted the bad memories, she said. She is holding on to the good ones. She looked forward to eternity. That is not a performance. That is not a calculated media statement. That is a woman carrying the specific grief of an estrangement that ended without resolution and choosing, in public, to describe love rather than grievance. The question this raises. Here is the harder question that Jonathan and Susie's responses force into the open. In the months since this story broke publicly, since the investigative reporting, since the departure of more than 30 ministry partners, since the documented financial controversies and the disputed allegations, a community formed online broadly aligned with Jonathan's position, people who believed the abuse allegations deserved serious investigation, people troubled by what expense reports and flight records suggested about the stewardship of donor money, people who concluded that something was wrong at Daystar and that accountability was necessary. That conclusion is not wrong. The documented record of financial concerns, the professional licensing findings against Doug Weiss, the governance structure that shields Daystar from standard financial transparency, none of those things become less worthy of scrutiny because Joni Lamb has died. The donors are still there. The viewers who trusted that network with their faith are still there. The former clients who gave accounts of being harmed at heart-to-heart counseling are still there. Their concerns do not evaporate at a memorial service. But something else has also been happening in those same comment sections and commentary channels. People declaring with certainty that Joni Lamb is not in heaven. People making pronouncements about her eternal state with a confidence that belongs only to God. People saying things about a dead woman that her estranged son, who was not called to say goodbye, who sat in the corner of her memorial, who came home and wrote about Tetris, would find unbearable to read. That is worth naming directly. Accountability does not require that. Truth-telling does not require that. The exposure of documented institutional failure is not strengthened by contempt for the dead. It is weakened by it, because it gives those who want to dismiss the accountability questions an easy target, and because it is simply not the same thing as what accountability actually requires, what the grieving son understood. There is a distinction that Jonathan Lamb appears to have grasped, and it is worth being precise about what it is. There is a version of grace that institutions deploy as a weapon, the kind that says forgive and move on as a mechanism to silence people raising legitimate concerns. That version of grace has been used against survivors in churches for decades. It deserves to be named and rejected whenever it appears. But refusing to declare where a person's soul has landed after death is not that. It is not institutional manipulation. It is not protecting the powerful. It is simply the acknowledgement that the final accounting belongs to a court none of us can access, and that speaking with certainty about things only God knows is a kind of presumption that does not serve truth. It just feels like it does. Jonathan did not say the institutional failures did not happen. He did not say the allegations were wrong. He did not say the financial questions were fabricated. He said he loved his mother and expected to see her again. Those are not contradictions. They are not naivety. They are the specific, difficult thing that grief looks like when it refuses to become something smaller than it actually is. What comes next? And what it requires. The Daystar succession question remains entirely unresolved. No individual has been publicly named as the new president. The board's statement referred to a leadership team without identifying a single member. Doug Weiss's ongoing role has not been formally addressed. Jonathan remains outside the institution his parents built. The financial questions, the flight records, the expense reports, the honeymoon charges, the quitclaim deeds, the property filings do not become less relevant because a memorial service was held. The governance structure that shields Daystar from standard nonprofit financial disclosure still exists. The former clients who gave accounts of harm at heart-to-heart counseling still deserve for those accounts to be taken seriously. All of that continues. None of it stops. But how it continues matters. The most credible accountability has always come from people who have not abandoned grace, who can look at what is wrong about an institution and what was human about the people inside it at the same time without collapsing those two things into each other. Jonathan and Susie Lamb are doing that. Publicly. In real time. With documented cause to do otherwise. They are worth paying attention to, not only for what they allege, but for how they grieve. Because the difference between justice and cruelty is not always in what you say. Sometimes it is in what you choose not to say, and what you choose to remember instead. Tetris, Scrabble, a college dorm room, a mother who laughed when she won. I love my mom. That is the question this moment places in front of everyone who has been following the Daystar story. Can accountability and grace genuinely coexist? And what does that actually look like in practice? Not as a theological concept, but as a choice people make in comment sections and on platforms and in the things they choose to say about someone who has died. I want to hear your honest answer. Drop it in the comments. This channel is a conversation, not a verdict, and the people who show up here consistently are worth talking with. Subscribe if you are not already. Turn on notifications. The succession story at Daystar is still developing. Board decisions, estate questions, leadership announcements, and when they happen, you will want the sourced account, not the rumor. Thank you for watching. Stay discerning.